Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. As Richard Weaver once said in his book, Ideas Have Consequences, ideas have consequences. During this season, other discussion programs look at the major events of the year. Here on Think Tank, we want to try something different to look at the ideas that have been bubbling to the surface, which we will do in precisely 26 and a half minutes. Joining us to discuss the influential ideas of 1994 are Judge Robert Bork, Olin Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and author of the forthcoming book, Slouching Toward Gomorrah, Modern Liberalism and American Decline; Robert Wright, author of The Moral Animal, The New Science of Evolutionary Psychology; Jodie Allen, editor of the Washington Post's Outlook section and one of America's leading idea brokers; and James Fallows, Washington editor of the Atlantic Monthly magazine and author of Looking at the Sun, The Rise of the New East Asian Economic and Political System. The topic before this House, 1994, the year in ideas, this week on Think Tank. Just consider some of the ideas that caught the imagination. Death with dignity, the politics of meaning, the backlash against political correctness, religion in the public square, sexual behavior within monogamous relationships, the chaos theory of foreign policy, reinventing government, sustainable development, high-tech conservatism, individual responsibility, cyberspace, free trade, let alone scientific notions like weakly interactive massive particles. Some very old ideas about virtue and morality rose toward the top of the public policy agenda. The Book of Virtues, a children's book by conservative intellectual William Bennett, has been on the bestseller list for an amazing 51 weeks. Pope John Paul's Crossing the Threshold of Hope has been a #1 bestseller. 1994 will also be remembered for the intellectual firestorm that erupted over Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein's book, The Bell Curve, and its analysis of class, race, and intelligence in America. In science, new insights into our genetic makeup made us think afresh about the nature of human nature. In the realm of economics, the general agreement on tariffs and trade spotlighted the rapid and sometimes disorienting changes in the emerging global economy. In cyberspace, the internet got hot as it extended its reach into millions of homes and offices. And as always, the world of politics made its contribution to the world of ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, present your ideas. Start your engines. Let's do it quickly once around and then we'll go into each one. Bob Bork.
Well, I think one of the major developments this year was the rising concern in the public about values, which I think is reflected in part in the last election in November.
Okay, Jim Fallows.
I'm interested in the emerging tension between two kinds of mobility, the very great and increasing mobility of ideas and goods and technology, and the still relatively limited mobility of people from country to country. And I think that tension is going to have some unexpected effects in the long run.
In terms of refugee flows?
Yes, that either it's difficult when people can't move and difficult when they can move too, and each of those situations has some consequences.
Right. Jodie Allen.
Well, my new idea is really an old idea repackaged for modern times. It's being pushed most forcefully by Malaysian Prime Minister Mohammed Mahathir, who argues that the West's brand of dynamic capitalism is so careless of social costs in its rampant pursuit of consumerism that it is in fact neither efficient nor satisfying to the very people, the consumers, that it's supposed to serve.
And that's why the Malaysians live at a higher standard of living than we do. We will come back to that. Okay, Robert Wright.
Well, I think social scientists and philosophers are finally starting to take seriously something that biologists have been saying for some time, which is that there is something called human nature. It's a product of evolution, and understanding it can shed light on things like life within the family, relations between the sexes, and in that way can inform discussion of morality and values.
All right, 4 separate ideas. Let us fondle them each briefly. Bob, can you elaborate on what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think we're increasingly dividing about our ideas of values. The general public tends to have one set of ideas, and what I might call the cultural elites by whom I am surrounded today.
Of course, you would not be a member yourself.
No. Tend to have different ideas, more egalitarian, more permissive. They divide, for example, on things like affirmative action, quotas, abortion on demand, and a number of welfare, illegitimacy, and so forth, the severity of punishment of crime. And I think that's polarizing more than ever before on those issues, and I think the last election showed it, because the moderates in both parties tended to lose. And we now have a much more liberal Democratic congressional party and a much more conservative Republican congressional
Is that
party.
the theme of your new book, Slouching Toward Gomorrah?
Well, there are a lot of themes in the new book,
Right.
I think.
All right.
I have a historical question about this, which is, at almost any given moment of history or part of the world, there's been a tension between an elite of that society, which was always more urbane, always more permissive in certain ways than the mass of that society. How different is the situation you're describing now from the way humanity has always been?
Well, I don't know that humanity has always been that way. I don't think, for example, that in many societies the intellectual and cultural elites felt alienated from the society at large. I think that's a modern phenomenon.
Well, think of the founding fathers versus the people in the backwoods in, in Appalachia. There was a certain distance between them.
I don't think in terms of values. In terms of wealth, yes. In terms of cosmopolitanism, yes. But I don't think in terms of values.
Oh, but surely in Europe, over the centuries, one had quite a different lifestyle and set of operating mores at the court than one had out in the countryside or even among the bourgeoisie. I mean, this
At the court, sure. We're talking about an aristocracy, but I'm talking about, for example, artists and intellectuals did not, I think, feel as alienated from their societies as ours do now.
That they were actually frequently conservative and defenders of the status quo.
That is true.
And what stage of history are we talking about?
Yes,
I think
I mean,
in the Renaissance, many of these people were...
We don't have to tell you.
So, I mean, I guess I agree with your basic observation about life today. I'm just wondering if this is an observation about life or about life today.
I think it's about life today, and I think what accounts for it is the idea of equality and individualism have been working their way through this civilization for a long time. But for a long time, individualism in particular was restrained by religion, by the necessity for hard work, which technology is increasingly relieving us of. And also technology is bringing us instant gratification and entertainment in a way that's never before possible.
But Bob Wright, does that touch any of your ideas on biology and innate human behavior?
Well, I think evolutionary psychology, the study of human nature, helps us understand why moral restraint is often in order. I mean, we're finding out that human nature is not all that we might hope that it is. And so if, for example, you want to make monogamy something that typically endures in a society, it's going to call for a certain amount of restraint. And historically, when that institution has been sustained, there's been a certain amount of moral sanction. I mean, for example, stigmatizing divorce. That's the sort of cost that we may have to pay if we're going to indeed preserve families amid all the forces that work against them, and one of those forces is really human nature.
Actually, both of these ideas feed into the more elaborate form of the idea that I think comes out of Asia now, but finds resonance over here, because essentially, Edward Luttwak applied the Asian argument to the American scene in a piece for Outlook in November that we got an enormous amount of feedback on it, and what he argued was essentially that there was also a divorce between the economic elites and the people, that America has, through its brand of destructive capitalism, which isn't new but is now operating in a much
creative
faster...
destruction was
yeah,
the phrase.
Right, creative destruction, right. It's not new, but it operates much faster now, and as a result, it's very threatening to communities, it's very threatening to families. It has produced a very wealthy international elite, but that elite has lost sight of these social goods, and that it is no wonder at this time that the Asians look at our model, and to be sure, Malaysia's standard of living is not as high as ours, but their degree of personal security is higher. And certainly the Japanese, which is the model that they're really looking at and looking to pursue, have achieved a level of social order. They've gone through what they bill as the worst recession since World War II. Their stock market fell in half, and yet there is no signs of social disorder.
Who are
The
these
crime rate
wi-
is rising in Japan.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, but
from
you know,
minuscule
from
to-
minuscule
so is
to,
ours.
Yeah,
you know,
but
I mean,
it's
to
a
even.
Well, let's stop for a moment and go on to Jim's thought for
Fine,
the year.
well,
We're sort of
fortunately,
halfway there, right?
It's a logical segue from what we've been
Okay.
talking about. I think there are two interesting phenomena of the modern world that have a common root. One we've just been discussing, which is the sense that America has been prospering, but many Americans, perhaps a large number, perhaps most, feel that over the last 20 years they have not prospered. That seems economically difficult to understand if the whole increases, but most people don't feel that they're better off. But it seems to be part of the sense of a increasingly globalized economy where there are greater returns on average for everybody, but they're in any one country you have a kind of microcosm of the world income distributions being created with one. So you have trouble when people can't leave the US to take opportunities in Korea or France. You also have trouble when people feel they have to leave their home country for the same reason. We see that right now in Mexico. You know, NAFTA in general has been good for Mexico. NAFTA has been terrible for the farmers in Chiapas. And there's a revolution now in Chiapas for this region. There's new surge of people from Mexico into the U.S., partly because their farming jobs aren't there anymore. So when people can't move, there's problems from globalization. When they can move, there's problems too. You see this in China as well. So this is my idea.
How does that relate to your
Well,
thoughts, Bob?
I would say, first of all, I think economic progress has led to social dislocation for a very long time now. It's broken up families. And from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, if you want to see a social environment in which people are much less likely to go crazy than in the modern environment, one thing you would naturally do is look at a hunter-gatherer society, which is very much like the society we evolved in. People, and this is the kind of place people's minds are designed to cope with. People stay near their families for the whole lives. They have lifelong friends. There are virtually no anonymous situations. They're always around people they know. And it's the difference between this and the modern environment is a very profound problem that people have to cope with. But I think economic progress has been creating this problem for a very long time, and what globalization does is add to the problem, I would say, incrementally.
I think that Litvak's point is that you're quite right. This is not new. It's just much, much faster. And of course, the numbers involved, just because the populations involved are much larger, are more frightening. And you literally, in China, for example, have 100 million people now kind of just dislocated. And we have a fair number too. But to go back to Ben's point, I mean, it is true that Americans have a much higher level of consumption now than they ever had before. More VCRs. Bob Samuelson wrote a very good column on this.
Well, Bob Samuelson
they
is talking about a global rolling boom for the next decade, which
but this
doesn't really
isn't what
square very
seems
well with
to
what you're
satisfy the
saying.
No,
soul,
it
to get
actually
back to
fits.
Bob's point, that we seem to be suffering from a very high degree of personal insecurity, not correlated with our consumer level of satisfaction at any point in time. We seem to be craving non-market goods, and yet at the same time,
That we're saying, craving what?
non-market goods.
Well, explain that.
Safe streets, stable communities, stable families, stable expectations. Those are the goods that the Asian countries value, and they encourage their populations to value them over consumer goods.
That's what you're saying.
And they grow
I
faster
think
at the
that's
same
right.
time.
I think that's right. And the trends we see now, I think, have been present for a long time, but they accelerated enormously in the 1960s. And those attitudes about permissiveness, about taking away stigma from things like divorce and so forth, really became very prominent then. And I think we're still suffering from them.
I wonder if I could ask a question here. Like Jodie, I've noticed the way the Asian model, values these things that are more difficult to value here. My question is, where can we find a theoretical basis in the American tradition, either our economic tradition or our political tradition, to say that some collective values, some of the traditional moral values, have standing? Because we have a theoretical basis for individual rights, a theoretical basis for individual consumer welfare, but no theoretical basis for the things you're talking about.
We haven't, and that's because I think when we, for example, wrote the Bill of Rights, we assumed constraints that were in the society then. When John Stuart Mill wrote on liberty, he assumed constraints that his theory would have destroyed if left to run free. And those constraints, religion, technology, need to work, and so forth, have steadily dropped away. so that we now face a very anxious and unhappy society, and it's very hard to know how to put it back together.
And so how are they reconstructed other than saying, oh, the 60s is still blighting us? There must be some way to move the ball farther down the field.
Well, I wish I knew how to. If I knew how to reconstruct a society, I'd be out there doing it.
Jim, let me just put a fine point on it. Do you believe in canings? That was one of the things that happened in 1994,
Yeah.
which is sort of the visual and physical embodiment of a more disciplined society with less freedom and more punishment.
I had this, I think, not impossibly nuanced view. I don't want canings here. I believed for them in Singapore. And my point in Singapore is that everybody knows how the system works there. There's no surprise. There's no misinformation. You know what the rules are. And so and I thought there was, assuming the guy was fairly, Michael Fay was fairly tried, then I believed he should have taken the punishment. But
You'd have to work back towards that. You couldn't reintroduce it suddenly here. We used to use stocks. We can't suddenly introduce them.
Would you like to move toward a system that includes canings?
I'd like to move toward a system of severe punishment. I'm not going to, canings maybe, I don't know, but corporal punishment, I don't see anything wrong with it.
I mean,
You can't suddenly do it. It would have to be a society that gradually reached a moral consensus that some things are so far outside what is allowable.
I mean, if I committed a white-collar crime, you think sooner or later it'd be a good idea to whack me around?
Which white-collar crime then?
Well, I don't know. If I knew what derivatives were, I would say derivatives. Right? But
I would argue that in the Singapore case, the power in their own society was not so much the physical punishment, but the sense of the certainty of it. And that even though this was a foreign kid, et cetera, that he was going to be punished. And that certainty, no matter what the actual punishment was, has a more deterrent effect than anything
And
else.
the humiliation in a society like that.
Yeah.
of
See,
being
that's
changed.
what we've lost, and it's too bad, because shame is a very efficient, cost-effective way of punishing people. The stocks.
We now have.
Now I'm not sure it could work because we have so little sense of public shame.
Well, now we have prisons full of people who feel no remorse for what they did, and being in prison is just part of life.
Well, and we have politicians like Newt Gingrich who are talking a great game of family values, but meanwhile he's left one family, he's left his wife, and the truth is, if you want to look at modern societies where monogamy has been a strong institution, they've been societies where a man who did that would have a real hard time getting elected to office. It's easy to talk a good game of family values, but it's not easy to do, and it'll come at some cost to everyone.
Well, our president has had some character problems in his background, which would have been disqualifying in a prior age.
But he hasn't left his family, and he has not talked with nearly the same degree of arrogance about
of course
family
he
values.
has. He ran his campaign on playing by the rules. I mean, that's what he keeps talking about. I mean, a return to responsibility
matches Newt Gingrich's, but I mean, this is.
There's no
No,
point
you're right. It doesn't match it.
saying which is
Trumps
worse.
it and double and redouble, I think. But
Well, without beating that issue anymore, I think the question for me is whether what we're talking about is like physical laws of entropy. That is, whether this is an irreversible process. When these stigmas go away, is it possible to reinstitute them? I don't know historically.
Well, historically,
There have been pendulum swings.
It did
certainly.
happen. It did happen once that I know of, and that was the Regency in England, which was an enormously dissolute period, followed by the Victorian era. Of course, England is right back to where they were.
Let me ask you this: is a society, in your judgment, better off with divorce or without divorce?
It's better off with.
A society without divorce has enormous personal problems.
It's worse for many individuals, but better for the society as a whole if the divorce is discouraged but not prohibited.
Let's go on to Bob Wright. Do you want to?
Yeah, the modern study of human nature is based on a new field called evolutionary psychology. And Jim was asking, is there some kind of theoretical basis for an emphasis on morality, on self-restraint maybe? At the early part of the Victorian period, part of the theoretical basis was, in a way, the doctrine of original sin.
Methodism came in.
The idea that we're really not all that great. There's an animal within us, and for society to do well, we all have to restrain it somewhat. And I would say, by my reading at least, I don't think every evolutionary psychologist would agree, there's quite a bit of that in evolutionary psychology. There's a lot of unfortunate news about human nature. For example, evolutionary psychology tells us why there is very rarely a good substitute for a child being reared by the two biological parents. Evolutionary psychologists are the ones who dug up the statistics on how much higher the risk of abuse or even murder by a parent is if one of the parents is a step-parent. it also, the evolutionary psychology tells us that, again, marriage is not necessarily, lifelong monogamous marriage is not really natural for either men or women, and it takes work, it takes sacrifice, and it may take moral sanction to make it work on a society-wide basis. So, I think, this is not the same as telling people we've proved there's a God and you'll go to hell if you don't behave. But on the other hand, I think the first step toward some kind of moral resurgence may be to understand that our impulses are not to be trusted.
Well, maybe your answer indicates the way we can evolve, if you will, towards some theoretical basis, because using Methodism as the example proves the problem, because for our state, no religious principle is a legitimate theoretical basis, even though for many individuals it is. But
why do you say that?
Well, because of Thomas Jefferson's separation church and state,
well,
et cetera.
We won't argue about Thomas Jefferson, who didn't know what he was talking about in this respect, but there's no reason why religion can't be strong in the society.
No, that's not
as
what
a
I'm
collective.
saying. What I'm saying that for the sort of foundations of the state, they cannot be drawn from religious doctrine because my Hindu neighbor will disagree, my Muslim neighbor will disagree. This is not, a mono-religious
But they won't
state.
disagree about morals.
They will disagree on something drawn from Methodist theology or Christian theology.
And
about
certainly
original
among
sin.
the elites that you're concerned about, religious belief is much less widespread than it
Oh,
was in the 90s.
they're indifferent or they're hostile.
But the point I'm making is that there is a quasi-religious role occupied by science these days in our society, and so something drawn from science has a legitimacy increasingly that religion doesn't have.
Jodie, where are you on evolutionary psychology?
well, I'm not exactly an expert
Broker
on
the
the subject,
idea.
but I think
broker
that
the
Bob's
idea, right.
that Bob is really onto something here to offer a secular basis, which can have religious concordances with it, but to offer one that can be the foundation for an American state, of a moral American state, in a way that is broadly acceptable to
Based
people of
on
different...
scientific principles rather than theological principles.
Yes,
but,
at least,
but ending up at the
at
same
least-
place.
At least with
That
scientific
scientific principle-
principles lending support to religion.
Well, that scientific principle could go the other way. They could say, well, that's the way we're built. Let's enjoy it. I don't see that it necessarily
Well, yeah, but I
implies
mean,
that-
I would argue that in the long run, you simply will not enjoy it. At least
You won't, that's right.
I mean, it's an empirical argument I'd make.
No, that's true.
It really
But
doesn't
and
make
this all
sense.
comes back again to the Asian argument that it is up to governments to remind people that there are these social goods, and then at the end, they will not feel so insecure as they did when they went to the polls in November, and I think there's a good case to be made that it was not the desire for tax cuts that people.
No.
But I
We
don't
have
think-
a relatively few minutes left. Let me ask this question and hear from all of you. There is a famous story in the book publishing business that the guy is looking for a title for his manuscript, and he is told by some marketing maven that the four most popular words in American markets are mother, dog, Lincoln, and doctor. So he entitles his book Lincoln's Mother's Doctor's Dog. Now, here we have four views around here. We have Lincoln, Mother's Doctor's Dog. I don't know who's going to play Lincoln. Is there a general theme that emerges from these apparently four disparate ideas? I mean, I sense, which I did not sense when we came into this program, that this is a fairly conservative, I mean, in the old terms, this is a fairly conservative view that everybody's saying we need values. Is that right?
I think that the commonality here is everybody is suggesting in different ways that the operating assumptions of American-style liberal democracy are in trouble in various ways. We need to find some different foundation for them. And I will add one minor brief note of optimism. I think the human flows I was talking about before work out better for the U.S. than they work out for many other countries. This is a country, as you've written many times, Ben, and I have too, that can take advantage of being renewed by people from outside. So that is one strategic advantage we have, but we need to pay attention to these foundations and values issues too.
All right. Jodie, do you see a unifying theme?
Oh
here?
yeah, I think you put your finger on it, and just to repeat it, yes, values. I think we are all trying to figure out how we can re-emphasize them in American society.
Seems to be the case, and I guess if as Judge Bork says, we're cultural elites or something, that's good news, right? Now, maybe it'll start to trickle down. Or
Well,
something.
Pug, you're a big pessimist, so surely you can't
Oh,
allow
sure.
all this
I enjoy
disagreement,
pessimism
right?
more than any other thing.
Right.
But I think we, in our culture right now, we have a strong strain which says that if we are biologically this way, let it go. And you remember in the 60s, people said, if it feels good, do it. Or they said, it is forbidden to forbid. And that's a kind of permissiveness that I think is still strong in our culture. and it's causing a lot of trouble.
I certainly agree it's true that one of the dangers as we understand the biological basis of more and more things is that people will use this as an excuse, and it's a real challenge.
Okay, thank you, Jodie Allen, Robert Wright, James Fallows, and Robert Bork. And thank you. We always enjoy hearing from our audience. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can also be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.